Hello, FBC Forest Park Church family. I wanted to reach out to you and just keep the lines of communication open about our strategy for reopening and kind of some of the things that we're thinking through and just our thought process here at the church. The number one filter that this decision is going through is actually the overall mission of our church. And so if I could define the mission of the church, of the New Testament church, in three simple terms, it would be this. We're called to love God, love people, and make disciples. Love God, love people, and make disciples. And I'd like to commend you on the fact that as we've gone through these unprecedented challenges and unforeseen situations around coronavirus, we have continued our mission, and we've continued it in a very strong way. We've continued it well. And so thank you, church. Thank you for those who are part of that M6 team that keep reaching out and making sure people are connected and cared for. We are doing quite well in continuing to fulfill the mission, even though we've faced some unforeseen challenges. Another filter that I'm looking through is actually a biblical mandate in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 23 through 25. It says this: "Let us hold tightly without wavering to the hope that we affirm, for God can be trusted to keep his promise." So there's the first part of the mission of the church. Love God. We are holding tightly to him and trusting him and following him. Verse 24, "Let us think of ways to motivate one another to acts of love and good works." Well, there's the second part of the church's mission. Love others. So we love God, we love others. And finally, in verse 25, "Let us not neglect our meeting together as some do, but let us encourage one another." And so to meet together in the same building, to be part of a church family that makes it a habit to come together and encourage one another, to love each other and to make disciples, it is a biblical mandate. And so I just want to make it perfectly clear that I have no interest in being an online church any longer than we have to be. It's created some challenges. It's probably actually done us a good bit of good. It's brought about some benefit, but we are under a biblical mandate to meet together, and that's tremendously beneficial as a church family. And so while we're not going to announce a date of return this morning, I do want you to know that returning is a priority for me and the other leaders in this church. Over the last several weeks, couple of months actually, I've been meeting diligently with other pastors, communicating regularly with those in similar leadership roles, ministry leaders. And in fact, even every Thursday, there's a statewide conference call with the Georgia Baptist simply on the topic of reopening our churches and trying to figure out the best strategies for doing that. Here's the best analogy that's come up that seems to be pretty accurate. We're all in the same storm, but we're all driving different ships, different boats. And so same storm, different boats. In other words, all of these pastors, all of these ministry leaders, all have their own context through which they are making decisions and trying to navigate. But there is one thing that's been very consistent, and that is all of these pastors are doing their dead level best to love their people and make the most meaningful and most caring and loving decisions on behalf of their people. And so those decisions may look different over the next couple of weeks or couple of months, but the heart behind them is the same. We're all in this same storm, but our boats are all a little bit different. Our contexts are all a little bit different. And so therefore our decisions, our timelines, the structures under which we all reopen may look a little different. So I want you to know that all of the pastors in our community love their congregation and are doing their best. And so as these churches come to different conclusions and make different decisions, I don't want you to be questioning the spirituality or the godliness of each church, because all of these pastors are filtering those decisions through a biblical mandate into the reality of their congregations and their situations. And so as things start to open up, other churches start to open up, different strategies are put in place, it's tempting to begin to compare one church to another and draw some conclusions. And I don't think that's very helpful for anybody in the overall body of Christ, because we are all in this together, even though we might be doing it slightly different ways. So here's some of the context of our church that we have to consider. First of all, we are in Clayton County. And Clayton County has remained in the top 8, sometimes even in the top 5 counties as far as the number of cases of coronavirus through this whole process. In addition to that, we are in the north end of Clayton County, which most of those cases have been concentrated to the north end of Clayton County simply because it's closer to Atlanta. In addition to that, we also have the demographics of our church to consider. And you guys returning the surveys and just looking through our church rolls and those things, a large majority of our church is 60 years old and above. And so for many of you, 65 and above, you're still under a shelter-in-place order. And so that order doesn't even run out until halfway through June. So with that context and the susceptibility of that particular part of our community to some of the challenges of the virus, that changes the way that we navigate and changes some of our strategy and some of our thinking. So again, as the pastor of this church, I love you and I care for you, and so we don't ever want to put you in a situation that potentially could be harmful for you. So those are some of the realities of the context of our decision making. In addition to that, we recently reached out to you via a survey, and we will do that throughout this process because we want to hear from you. We want you to be a part of the decision-making process, and we want your voice to be heard. I don't want to be making decisions from an ivory tower on behalf of you. I want us collectively coming to some sort of agreement on how we proceed forward. And so there will be more of those surveys along the way, and you can check your text messages from those. A couple of things that came out from that survey. Number one, this is a huge praise. By and large, our church family has been protected from the fallout of coronavirus, both from a health standpoint. Most of our folks in our direct church family have not experienced any direct health consequences related to the virus, and also from an economic standpoint. Many of you indicated that your wages had not changed at all. A few of you had hours cut back and a couple of, furlough days and whatnot, but you were still able to manage your household, and you weren't sweating the bills on your household and putting food on the table for your family. And so I just want to praise God for his protection of our church family through this whole process. And guys, I want you to recognize that is yet another sign that God has big plans for this church, and he is protecting us and leading us through these challenges. And so we don't want to take that for granted. We want to thank God for all that he's doing on behalf of you and your families in and around your homes. The other thing that came back is most of you are overwhelmingly happy in the current situation. Now clearly we all want to return to church, and we all miss seeing each other, and that was a big theme. What do we miss? Well, we miss the fellowship, but we miss the seeing our friends and family in church on Sunday morning and Wednesday nights. But outside of that one component of connection and fellowship, by and large, you guys are actually indicating to us you're quite satisfied with how we've navigated through these challenges around coronavirus. Now, again, we don't want to be an online church any longer than we have to be, but I think we're doing it fairly well. We seem to still be fulfilling the mission of the church, and many of you have actually expressed that you've gotten more out of the Bible studies by being in your living room and being free from all the distractions in the church building and the sanctuary and traveling here and all the stresses of Sunday morning, that during this time you've actually gotten more out of the Bible studies because you've been able to quietly focus and be in a context where it's easier for you to pay attention. So that goes back to our mission, loving God, loving people, and making disciples. Again, I think we're fulfilling that mission, albeit in a different way, but we're actually doing it quite well as a church family. And so you've expressed some of the benefits of being at home without distractions. So that's sort of the feedback we've been getting is we all want to be back together, but we want to do it in a safe way, in a respectful way to our church family, and we're all making the best of this current opportunity. I want to share with you something that I experienced this last Sunday. Many of you know that I spent 7 years traveling full-time as a chaplain in NASCAR, and NASCAR returned to television. It was one of the first live sporting events to come back to television on Sunday, just a couple of days ago. And I was looking forward to that event. It's some semblance of normal. It was going to be fun to watch it. And for me, it's fun to see some of my friends again and be able to, see faces that I hadn't seen in a while. Well, when I turned on the broadcast, immediately it became apparent that things were not normal at all. It was very different. I actually did not see very many of my friends because the ones that I had relationships with were not essential personnel, and so they were not even at the Speedway. And the stands were empty, and the energy in the environment was completely different, almost gone. The reporters were standing at significant distance away from the athletes, and just everything about it looked and felt different. It was so different that it was no longer comforting to me. It was no longer an exciting event for me. It actually became an event that sort of brought on some anxiety for me because it was just so different. And I couldn't see my friends. And I a lot of times on race day, I'll shoot them a text message or whatever. And they just weren't even there. They weren't even present. And so what I thought was going to be somewhat of a normal event, in the reality of the day, was far from normal, and therefore became largely a distraction from what it normally was. The stark differences, I would argue, actually detracted from the event and heightened the level of anxiety. Well, guys, that's my fear in returning to church. All of us want to come back. We are going to come back to church at some point. We're desperate for that sense of connection and that fellowship with friends and family inside of a biblical context. And so I promise you that we are going to get back to that at some point. But when we talk about returning, what many of us are envisioning is what we left behind in March. Well, guys, I just got to be frank with you. I got to level with you. Right now, if we come back, it will not look anything like it looked when we left the church building in March. I got a 10-page document from the governor's office and also from the Georgia Baptist Convention of guidelines and regulations on what it means to return on Sunday morning, return to our building with any kind of normalcy. And unfortunately, I just want to kind of spell out what the reality of Sunday morning looks like, because it is far from normal. So here's what coming back to church would look like at this point. First of all, the only thing that we would have is our worship service at 10:45. There would be no childcare, no nursery, no children's church, no Sunday school, no Sunday night studies, no Wednesday night studies. The only thing we would be allowed to do would be our normal 10:45 worship service. In addition to that, we would not be able to have the choir because we have to be careful the proximity as people sing, and when you sing, your voice carries, and your breath and the air coming out of your mouth carries further than just in normal breathing. So we would not be able to have choir. Our music would look very different than what it's looked like in the past. We would also have to take up anything that normally gets handed out or is available for people to hold in their hands as part of the community. So that means in the backs of the pews, no hymnals, no pew Bibles. We couldn't hand out bulletins. We would not have offering envelopes available in the backs of the pews, and we would not actually even be able to pass the offering plate. We'd have to do that in a very different way. As you entered into the sanctuary, every other pew would be blocked off, and you would have to sit in a checkerboard pattern around the sanctuary in order to be socially distanced and away from those in the building. After the service is over, you would be dismissed individually by row and sent out a prescribed exit route out of the building. So a lot of that connection, a lot of that socializing that we're looking, fellowship that we're looking forward to, we actually in reality would not be able to do. You'd be waving at your friends and seeing your friends and church family from across the room, but there would be very limited intimate, personal conversation. The elevator would have to be managed and cleaned by an attendant. And so we'd have to watch the elevator and the hygiene of the elevator very closely. And then quite frankly, here's the deal killer for me. Our restrooms. I've got two options on restrooms. Number one, they're just closed. When you come to the service on Sunday morning, the restrooms would just simply not be available. And so as a parent of young children, that's a real challenge for us. And I know for many in our church, that's a personal challenge. So no restrooms, that's just a deal killer for me. And then if we did open the restrooms, they would have to be cleaned and sanitized behind each person that uses them, which means there would be a volunteer there in the restroom waiting on you to finish whatever needs to be done and then clean up after you. And that's just uncomfortable for everybody. And so for me, that just, all of those regulations, and there are many more, but those are some of the highlights. Honestly, that just sounds worse to me than staying at home. Right now, we've kind of gotten used to the routine and we've sort of accepted the reality of what's going on. And while we want to be back, to come back under those guidelines and under those regulations, just honestly sounds more difficult than it's worth. And so here's a good question that we're asking. One, does the scenario of returning actually provide comfort for our church family, or does it heighten anxiety? Does it breed anxiety? And so I think under all those regulations and coming back to something that looks that dramatically different would actually breed anxiety more than it would provide a comfort to our church family. So we have a couple of goals going forward. Again, this morning I am not going to announce a date of return. I'm just communicating to you some of the things that we're thinking through and the reality as we continue forward. Number one, here's our goals. We want to continue to fulfill our church's mission. We want to love God, love others, and make disciples. If we find ourselves unable to do those three things in an online format, then we will make some drastic changes quickly. But we've not found ourselves in that situation yet. And you guys are doing a great job in continuing the mission of the church. So our goal, first and foremost, is continuing that mission. We also want everything that we do to point people toward Christ. So that's the purpose of the church. And so everything that we do, from continuing basic operations in Mission Forest Park to our youth team doing their dead level best to stay in touch with our youth department and keep them engaged, our children's ministry, handing out Bible studies and coloring books and all kinds of things, Nina staying connected with our Sunday school teachers, the M6 team reaching out to church members, guests, and community members, the online services, everything. We want everything that we do to point people toward Christ. And I think we as a church family are actually doing a really good job at that at this point. We also want the church to be a place of comfort. So again, this should be a place of comfort where people can encounter God and seek God and get their questions answered, and where we can ultimately make disciples. And coming back under all of those intense regulations, to me, is not comforting at all. I think it would actually breed additional anxiety. We also want to love our people and take care of them. And so again, looking at the demographics of our church, we want to make sure that when you return here, you can have confidence that you're returning safely and securely. And so we're just looking at that. And right now, we're not in a position as a church to be able to provide a safe environment under reasonable operating guidelines. Also, I have a personal desire. As your pastor, I want to remain a shepherd, and I do not want to become a cop. And so if you came right now, I would be in the role of regulating your movements and making sure that we stay socially distanced and separated and making sure that everything's clean. It would put me in the role of an enforcer or a policeman versus your shepherd and your pastor. And I just really don't want to cross that line. I want to maintain that relationship of shepherd. I also have the goal of minimizing the transition time. And so I'm of the opinion that the church united is stronger than the church divided. So regardless of the scenario that we are united in, I think we're stronger when we're all in the same boat. So at some point, we are going to reopen, and some of you will choose to come back and some of you will not. And that's fine. We want you to make a decision that's comfortable for you. But I am trying to minimize that time of a divided church. It is a particular challenge to us as a church to have, say, 40% of the church sitting in the congregation and 60% still at home watching on the other side of the camera. That creates an additional dynamic, an additional divide between us as a church family, and changes the way that we lead and that we engage. And so there's never going to come a time where we just flip the switch and everybody returns on the same Sunday. But I do want to minimize that transition period and make that as quick and efficient as possible. So my gut feeling, because I think that we are a stronger united, is I'm of the opinion we're probably going to keep our church home longer in an effort to minimize that transition into a return to somewhat of normal operations. Here's the other thing. When we talk about normal, none of us knows what tomorrow brings. None of us. In fact, every time that I've announced the next step that we're going to do, something has changed. And so today I'm being very careful not to announce a date of return, because every time I've done that, something's changed and we've had to push it back. So what we've learned is none of us know what tomorrow brings. So the only thing we can do is trust God for the next step. He says, my word is a light unto your feet, a lamp unto your path. And if you've ever walked in the dark at night with a lamp, it doesn't reveal very much more than just the next step. And so that's where we are as a church family. It's a little bit of an uncomfortable place to be, but it's also really an exciting place to be, because we've been forced into a position where we have to trust God. Honestly, that's how we should be functioning as a church anyway. But if we're all honest with ourselves, we know we get into our routines and our plans and our traditions and all of those things. And so we kind of deviate from that. But God has put us in a spot where we have to trust Him for the next step, because none of us knows what's coming tomorrow. And so some things that we're doing will return to normal as we trust God for what we're doing coming up. But some things will not. Some things will never go back to the way they were. And that's probably a good thing, because we have an opportunity here as a church to sort of rebuild and restructure. And we don't have to be tied to the way things always were. God's put us in a position where we have a newfound freedom to follow Him and trust Him and obey Him and listen to His words. And as we rebuild and come back to the church, we get to seek Him for each step along the way. So guys, that's what I'm asking you to do with me. Will you diligently seek God and His leading along with me as your church pastor? I want to hear from you. I want to know what God's saying to you. We've been doing these prayer journals and we've been talking about prayer for the last month. And so now the rubber meets the road. We've got to figure this thing out together. So I'm asking you to lift me up in prayer, but I'm asking you to go to God on behalf of our church and listen to God. And I want to know what God is telling us as a church family. I want to hear from you. So will you commit today to diligently seeking God along with me? Because we are all in this together. And so the only way forward is that we must follow Him for each step of the way as we move into the future of what First Baptist Church Forest Park looks like. So church, that's kind of the strategy going forward. I wish I could give you more information, but I just don't know what the next weeks and months look like. But those are the things that we're considering. Those are the things we're thinking through. And I wanted you to begin to understand some of the challenges that we're facing in the coming days. So I love you. We're here for you. We're doing everything we can to serve you. And I look forward to hearing from you how God is working and moving in your life and what God is revealing to you about the future of our church family. Thank you for your time, and reach out to me anytime. Thanks, guys.